The last Wednesday of February in 1812 was cold enough that the candles at Almac's assembly rooms burned with a particular ferocity, as though they understood they were the only warmth available, and the women who filled the room had draped themselves accordingly in silk and ermine, and the kind of jewels that collect light and return it in multiples. The orchestra had not yet begun. The floor was still clear, and across that clear floor, moving steadily from the east doors toward the patroness's table in the far corner, walked Miss Cecily Warne. She carried a note in her gloved hand. The note was from Mrs. Holt, the Countess of Holt, Cecily's employer of 3 months, who had been seized by one of her periodic headaches and required the patroness Lady Castlereagh to know she would not be taking her usual chair that evening. Mrs. Holt had written the note herself in a large wavering hand and had pressed it into Cecily's fingers with the comfortable certainty of a woman who had never had occasion to consider what it cost another person to cross a room like this one. The gown was white muslin. It had been white muslin when Cecily's mother had worn it, 20 years prior, and it had been retrimmed twice since her mother's death. Once by the dressmaker in Ipswich, who had done what she could for a shilling, and once by Cecily herself, by lamplight. The winter before she had accepted Mrs. Holt's offer of employment. The hem was straight. The ribbon at the waist was cream and clean. The gloves were white, though the right thumb seam had been repaired with thread a shade too pale, a detail visible only if someone were looking. Someone was always looking. She heard them at the card tables first. Not words at that distance, only a shift in the quality of the sound in the room, the way a conversation drops half a register when it becomes about something specific. Then a laugh, bright and particular, from a cluster of women near the second pillar from the door. Lady Sophronia Vane's laugh was unmistakable to anyone who had spent a season in London. It carried. Cecily did not alter her pace. She had learned this. Walking at the same pace was the thing. Not faster, which would look like flight, and not slower, which would look like she was attending to the sound. The same pace, eyes forward, the note held at her side. 20 more steps to the patroness's table. She counted them. She was at 14 when a second laugh joined Lady Vane's, and at 11 when she recognized, without looking, that the laughter had organized itself around her. The room had done what the room did. It had found a thing that did not belong, and was deciding, collectively and in the way rooms decide such things, what it thought. At the far end of the long room, near the terrace doors that opened onto the cold garden, a man stood alone. He had his back to most of the company. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, in a navy tailcoat that fitted him without concession to fashion's current padding and puffery. He was not looking at Lady Vane. He was not looking at the card tables. He was looking at Cecily Warne as she crossed the floor, and whatever was in his face at that moment, it was not amusement. She did not see him. She reached the patroness's table, delivered the note, murmured the appropriate explanation, waited for the acknowledgement, and turned back the way she had come. The laughter had resolved itself into conversation by then. The room moved on. Rooms always moved on. What Cecily did not know, as she walked back across the floor and out the east doors into the marble corridor, was that the Duke of Alverston had watched every one of her 40 steps. Cecily had come to London 6 weeks before, in a hired post-chaise that Mrs. Holt had arranged as part of the terms of her employment, which were generous by any standard available to the daughter of a recently deceased country clergyman. The Reverend Thomas Warne had died in October, quietly, in the rectory he had occupied for 30 years, with his books about him and his daughter holding his hand. He had left her £80, the calf-bound volume of Cowper's poems that had sat on his desk since before her birth, and a letter of introduction to Mrs. Holt, who had been a parishioner long ago and who wanted someone sensible to read to her in the evenings and accompany her to the social engagements her rheumatism no longer permitted her to attend alone. Cecily was 23. She was educated, principled, and entirely without prospects. This she understood without self-pity, the way one understands the price of bread or the distance to the next town. It was a fact of her condition, not an injustice done to her specifically, and she had arranged herself accordingly. The Cowper poems were in her reticule. They had been in her reticule since the morning she had packed it in Ipswich. She did not know why she kept them there, except that they had been her father's, and the weight of them was a weight she recognized, and she was in a city where almost nothing else was. Mrs. Holt's house in Brook Street was comfortable and run by a staff of 6 who had served the Countess for decades and who regarded Cecily with a cautious, wait-and-see warmth that she understood was the most she could reasonably expect. Her room was on the 2nd floor, small and clean, with a window that looked onto the mews. She was given her meals at the family table when Mrs. Holt was at home and was left to her own devices, mostly when Mrs. Holt rested. She was paid £40 per annum, which was £20 more than a governess of her qualification could expect. And she was grateful for it with the specific, quiet gratitude of someone who has recently understood what its absence would mean. She had been in London a week when she first heard the phrase. It was at the Hartley card party, a small gathering to which Mrs. Holt had brought her as an extra pair of hands. Lady Sophronia Vane had been present in the deep sapphire silk gown and the jet necklace that were, Cecily would come to understand, her standard winter evening armor. Lady Vane had examined Cecily once, with the thoroughness of a woman inspecting a questionable item in a shop, and had turned to the young woman at her elbow, Miss Harriet Belmore, and said in the particular half-voice designed to carry no farther than intended, and no less, "The clergyman's charity case. One wonders why Prudence Holt troubles herself." Miss Belmore had said nothing. She had the grace, or the indifference, not to echo the remark. She had not disputed it, and that, too, was a kind of verdict. Cecily had been pouring Mrs. Holt's tea. She had poured it steadily, filled the cup without spilling, replaced the pot, and said nothing. She carried the phrase with her out of the Hartley house and back to Brook Street, where she sat in her small room with the window open despite the cold, and she thought about her father, who had taught her that a person's worth was not a room's business. And she had believed him. She still believed him. Only the believing, she was finding, was work. If the first weeks were work of that quiet, grinding kind, the 3rd week of February brought a different kind of difficulty, because it brought the Duke of Alverstone back to London. Cecily did not know this at first. She knew it only as a general fact relayed at Mrs. Holt's breakfast table that Julian Ashworth, the Duke of Alverstone, had returned from the continent at his Aunt Lady Ashworth's insistence after 2 years of what his family had been calling, in the careful euphemism the period offered, a private withdrawal from public life. What his family was less publicly articulating was that the withdrawal had followed the death of his Duchess, Catherine, in childbed, along with the infant, on a November night when the Duke had been at Westminster in a committee chamber and had arrived home to find his house silent in a way that houses were only ever silent once. Mrs. Holt told Cecily this in the tone she used for information she considered relevant, but not urgent. Cecily listened and thought nothing of it. The Duke of Alverstone was not her concern. His grief was not hers to parse. She had her own to manage. She met him 3 days after Almack's, and it was not in a ballroom. Lady Ashworth, Julian's aunt, was an old friend of Mrs. Holt's, and had issued an invitation for the 2 of them to take tea at Grosvenor Square on a Tuesday afternoon. Mrs. Holt had accepted before her headache had settled in on Tuesday morning. And so it was Cecily who went alone, with her reticule and her carefully pressed walking dress and a message of apology in Mrs. Holt's wavering hand. Lady Ashworth was in the drawing room when Cecily was shown in, and she received the message with good-natured disappointment and proceeded to offer Cecily tea anyway, on the grounds that she had already rung for it, and it would go to waste. Cecily accepted, and they sat for 20 minutes talking about Mrs. Holt's health and the quality of the season's music. And it was pleasant in the way that conversations with genuinely kind elderly women are pleasant. And when Lady Ashworth was called briefly from the room by a matter with the housekeeper, Cecily sat alone and took out the Cowper poems. She had been reading for 4 minutes when she became aware that someone had entered the room from the corridor door rather than the main entrance. He was very still for a large man. She did not hear him until he was already in the room. She looked up, and he was standing just inside the door, in the navy tailcoat and the white cravat, looking at the book in her hands, with an expression she could not immediately interpret. "Your Grace," she said, and rose, and he said, "Sit down." And the command was issued in a level voice, not unkind, and she sat. He did not sit. He stood at the edge of the room, and after a moment he said, "What is it that you are reading?" She told him. He said nothing for a moment. "My mother read Cowper," he said. "He is good company," she said. "He is." A pause. "You are Mrs. Holt's companion." "Yes, Your Grace." "She is unwell." "A headache only. She asked me to convey her regrets to Lady Ashworth." He nodded once. His eyes, which were the dark gray of winter water, moved to the book again, and then to her face, and she had the very particular sensation of being seen by someone who was not in the habit of looking. It lasted only a moment. Then Lady Ashworth returned, and the moment arranged itself into the ordinary afternoon it had been before, and the Duke excused himself, and Cecily was shown out half an hour later, with a warmth from Lady Ashworth that she carried back to Brook Street, like something borrowed, uncertain whether it was truly hers to keep. She did not tell herself anything about his eyes. She was not a fool. The charity route at Viscount Egerton's townhouse was the following Saturday, and it was one of those large, slightly overheated gatherings that exist primarily to permit people of various stations to feel they have contributed to a cause without much inconvenience. There were tables set with small items for sale to benefit the Naval Fund, and a light supper, and enough people that the rooms were warm despite the February cold outside. Cecily was there with Mrs. Holt, who sat with 2 old friends at a small table near the fireplace, and did not require much attendance, and so Cecily made herself useful at the sale tables, and tried not to stand in anyone's way. She was helping an elderly gentleman find his hat near the cloakroom when she heard the sound from the supper corridor. Not laughter this time, but the sharp carrying voice of Lady Vane, issuing a correction. A young girl, perhaps 15, in the plain dark dress of a kitchen servant, had been carrying a tray of syllabub glasses into the supper room from the kitchen passage, and she had caught the tray on the doorframe, and 2 glasses had gone down. They were syllabub glasses, not crystal, and they had not broken, only spilled, and the girl was on her knees gathering them, her face crimson, while Lady Vane stood over her with the ivory and black fan held at a measured height, and said in the voice that projected precisely as far as she intended it, that some people ought not to be permitted in rooms where good things were kept. The girl's hands were shaking. Cecily crossed the corridor in 4 steps. She knelt beside the girl and gathered the 2 glasses, and she said, quietly and clearly, so that the girl could hear it, and only the girl, "You have done nothing wrong. The doorframe is too narrow. Any person would have done the same." Lady Vane said nothing. Cecily rose, replaced the glasses on the tray, steadied it in the girl's hands, and turned. Lady Vane looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman recalibrating. Then she moved away. Cecily returned to the sale tables. Her pulse was steady. She had not done anything unusual. She had only said the true thing. What she did not know was that from the doorway of the adjacent drawing room, where he had come in search of his brother and found instead this, the Duke had watched the whole of it. He stood in the doorway after Lady Vane had gone, long enough for the girl to disappear into the kitchen passage with her tray intact. Then he turned and went back into the drawing room and stood at the window for some time, looking at the street below, where the lamps were just being lit. His brother Gerald found him there and said something about the supper being quite good, and Julian said that he was glad to hear it. And Gerald, who was perceptive in ways he rarely acknowledged, said nothing further and handed him a glass of wine. The following Tuesday, Lady Ashworth sent another invitation to Brook Street. Mrs. Holt was well enough to attend this time, and she and Cecily went together, and it was a small party of 6, and the Duke of Alverston was among them. He was not easy in company. He did not seek it. He stood near the wall when he could, and spoke when addressed, and otherwise kept his own counsel. And Cecily, watching him the way one watches a thing without quite admitting the watching, thought that he was a man paying a very precise social debt to his aunt and calculating exactly the minimum required. Twice, across the afternoon, he addressed a remark directly to her. Once about the quality of the light through Lady Ashworth's south-facing windows, which was genuinely good, and once, as they were standing near the fire while Mrs. Holt talked to the other guests about whether the season had offered her anything worth hearing. The Italian mezzo-soprano at the Argyle Rooms, she said. She was worth hearing. Were you taken there by Mrs. Holt? I walked, she said. It is not far from Brook Street. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted just slightly, and he said, in a voice pitched for her alone, "Do not walk home from the assembly rooms, Miss Warne. The hours are late, and the streets are not safe. I will speak to my aunt about the carriage." She said she was quite used to walking in the evening, and that she preferred it. And he said, the words level, nevertheless. And that was the end of it. She walked home from Brook Street to Mrs. Holt's house in the March cold, and she did not let herself think about the way he had said her name. It was the first time he had used it. He had said it as though it were something he had considered before saying, which was a fact she needed to not make anything of, and she was disciplined enough, mostly, to succeed. It was 3 days after that small tea party that she came to understand what she was up against. She had gone to Almack's again with Mrs. Holt, and Mrs. Holt had wanted to sit with her friends near the card room, and Cecily had been standing in the corridor outside the card room door, waiting, when Lady Vane came through it with Miss Belmore at her side. Lady Vane looked at Cecily and said with a pleasant, conversational confidence that made the words more cutting for their lightness, "Still at it, I see. Though I imagine Alverstone's attentions will not survive a second look at the clergyman's charity case." Miss Belmore said nothing. She moved her gaze from Cecily to the middle distance, with the particular vacancy of a beautiful young woman removing herself from an unpleasant scene without moving her feet. Cecily said, "Good evening, Lady Vane," and did not change her expression. And Lady Vane swept on. She stood in the corridor for a moment after they had passed, feeling the thing settle into her the way cold settles. Not shockingly, but completely. The season had decided what she was. Lady Vane had decided it before the season had properly begun, and she had stated it twice now, in front of witnesses, in the particular bright voice that left no room for doubt. What she could not decide, standing in that corridor, was what the Duke had thought himself doing. He was a duke. He was in mourning, if mourning was a thing one did at 2 years' remove. And perhaps it was. And perhaps it had no end. He had spoken to her about the light through windows and the Italian mezzo-soprano. He had told her not to walk home. She had been telling herself it meant nothing. It occurred to her in the corridor outside the Almack's card room that she had been telling herself this because it was the only thing she could safely believe. She went back in and stood near Mrs. Holt and looked at the floor. And at the far end of the room he stood near the terrace doors, exactly where he had been standing on the last Wednesday of February, and she did not look at him, and she was not certain whether he looked at her. If she could have seen his expression at that moment, she might have thought differently. She did not have that particular mercy. It was a week later that she understood how completely she had misjudged the shape of the threat. Jennings, Mrs. Holt's senior footman, was a man of 40, with a long face and a habit of precision that made him both reliable and, occasionally, the bearer of information he delivered with great care. He came to Cecily's room in the early evening with his cap in his hands and said, with the careful circumspection of someone trying to be kind, that he had been at the Van Soirée the previous evening on an errand for Mrs. Holt, and that he had overheard, in the hallway, a conversation between Lady Vane and 2 other ladies, which he thought she ought to know about. Lady Vane had sent a note to Mrs. Holt that morning. Cecily had not seen it. Jennings knew what it contained because Mrs. Holt's lady's maid had been present when it was read, and the maid had told Jennings, and Jennings had come upstairs to Cecily's room rather than pretend he did not know. The note suggested, in polite and measured language, that Mrs. Holt's companion had been making herself forward with the Duke of Alverston in a manner calculated to embarrass his family, and that in Lady Vane's opinion, which was offered in the most affectionate spirit imaginable, the clergyman's charity case ought to be returned to the country before she did the Countess a disservice. Jennings said, "I thought you should know, Miss Warne, before Mrs. Holt sends for you." Mrs. Holt sent for her at 7 o'clock. The conversation was not unkind. Mrs. Holt was never unkind. She was old and a little confused by the note, which she had read several times through her failing sight, and she was a woman who had navigated the social machinery of London for 50 years and had learned that Lady Vane's opinions were not to be dismissed by anyone who valued their standing. She was also, Cecily could see, genuinely troubled, in the way that people who mean well are troubled when they discover that doing the right thing is inconvenient. Mrs. Holt said that she did not personally believe a word of Lady Vane's insinuation, but that she thought it better, given everything, if Cecily did not attend the Ashworth ball at the end of the week. She said she was sure Cecily understood. Cecily understood. She went up to her room and she sat on the edge of the bed for a while, looking at the window over the mews. Then she opened the small trunk from under the bed, and she began, methodically, to fold her things into it. Not all of them. Only enough for a night, in case Mrs. Holt wanted her to leave sooner. The walking dress, the second pair of gloves, the retrimmed muslin which she folded with the particular care she had always given it, the care that was half habit and half the memory of her mother's hands. The Cowper poems she put in last. She held them for a moment, the spine warm from her hand, the pressed flower still marking the task. She was not angry. She did not permit herself anger because anger implied that she had expected something different, and she had not. She had known since October that the world was arranged in a particular way, and that her place in it was contingent and small, and that the only thing she could control was whether she behaved well inside it. She had behaved well. It had not been enough. This was the thing her father had not told her, or perhaps had told her, and she had not understood until this moment. behaving well was not a shield. It was only a way of meeting what came with your head level. She got up and closed the trunk and sat back down on the bed, and thought about him standing near the terrace doors, and about the way he had said her name, and she told herself firmly and finally that it had been nothing. And she almost believed it. The next morning she rose at her usual hour and dressed and went to her duties with her face composed, and she said nothing to anyone about the trunk under the bed, or the Cowper poems, or the way the walls of the small room had seemed, in the dark, to be very close. There was a shawl. Lady Ashworth had lent it to Mrs. Holt at a tea party the previous month, a Norwich shawl in muted green that was too fine for Mrs. Holt to have forgotten about, and too borrowed for it to be returned by any means less than personal delivery. Mrs. Holt had not forgotten it. She had, however, given Cecily, on Thursday morning, the task of returning it to Grosvenor Square. It was a 10-minute walk. Cecily wrapped herself in her own plain coat, took the shawl in its wrapping paper, and went. She did not tell herself anything about where she was going. She told herself she was returning a shawl. Grosvenor Square in early March had a particular quality of clear, cold light, the kind that comes after rain, and the houses stood along it with the dignified indifference of buildings that have been important for a long time. Number 14 was the Ashworth house, stone-fronted, 3 wide stories, with a black door and a brass plate. Cecily went up the steps and knocked. She had not considered that he might be in. He was not often at home in the morning. She had asked Mrs. Holt once what the Duke did with his days, and Mrs. Holt had said he attended the Lords when required, and otherwise rode in the park. And that had been the extent of the inquiry. The door was answered by a footman who took her card and the shawl package and went to find Lady Ashworth, and Cecily stood in the entrance hall on the black and white tiled floor and looked at the portrait at the top of the stairs, which was of a woman she did not recognize, and waited. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, only footsteps on the upper stairs, and then his voice asking the footman something she could not quite hear, and then the footsteps descending. And he came around the landing and stopped. He was in shirt sleeves. He was, she gathered, not expecting callers, and the shirt sleeves were the evidence of it. And she felt the small, particular awkwardness of being in a man's house when he was not armored for company. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the wrapped shawl in the footman's hands, and then he looked back at her. "Miss Warne," he said. "Your Grace, I came to return Lady Ashworth's shawl to her. I apologize for the intrusion. Mrs. Holt asked me to bring it in person." He descended the remaining stairs. He said to the footman, "Find my aunt, please, and have tea sent to the blue drawing room." Then to Cecily, "Come up." She followed him to the blue drawing room, which was on the first floor and was called blue because of the curtains and the silk on the walls, both the color of a winter afternoon sky. He went to the window and looked out at the square, and she stood near the door, and after a moment he said, without turning around, "Mrs. Holt has asked you not to come to the Ashworth ball." She said, "Yes, Your Grace." He turned. His face was the controlled, unreadable face she had first seen at Almack's, the face that offered nothing. And for a moment she thought that was all it was, and then she looked at his eyes, and they were not unreadable at all. They were very dark, and they were very still. In the way that water is still when something has just moved beneath it. "That will not do," he said. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "Lady Vane's note to Mrs. Holt was an interference," he said. "I am aware of it. I should have prevented it. You could not have known she would send it. I knew her," he said. "I knew what she was capable of. I chose to believe she would not take it so far." A pause. "That was my error. not yours." She looked at him. The winter light from the window fell across the side of his face and caught the fine line between his brows, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he was a man who was accustomed to holding himself responsible for things that went wrong in his vicinity, whether or not the responsibility was genuinely his. She thought of the Cowper poems in the trunk under her bed. "You did not make me pack a trunk," she said, and he turned fully to face her. And the thing in his face was surprise, which she had not expected from him. And it was gone in a moment. And she said more quietly, "I am not helpless, Your Grace. I am only without resources. Those are not the same condition." He was silent. Then he said, "No, they are not." She looked at the window. Outside, the square was going about its business in the clear, cold light. A carriage passed. 2 women with market baskets. "Will you come to the ball?" he said. She thought of Mrs. Holt's face, troubled and kind, and of Lady Vane's voice carrying in the Almack's corridor, and of the trunk under the bed. "I do not think Mrs. Holt will permit it," she said. "I will speak to my aunt," he said. "Lady Ashworth will invite Mrs. Holt personally, with a note she cannot easily refuse. Mrs. Holt will want to come. She will want to bring you." Cecily looked at him. "Why?" she said. And the word was plain and direct, without deflection. Because she had decided in the last 3 minutes that deflection was no longer a thing she had the energy for. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Because I watched you cross a room in a dress that the whole room had decided was beneath its notice, and you did not change your pace." She could feel her pulse in her throat. "And because," he said, and his voice was very quiet, "I watched you kneel in a corridor for a kitchen girl who had dropped 2 glasses and speak to her as though she were worth speaking to." He was looking at her the way he had looked at her that first afternoon in the Almack's great room, from the far end by the terrace, except that she could see it now, clearly, and she could not pretend she had not. "I would like for you to come to the ball," he said, "if you are willing." Lady Ashworth's note arrived at Brook Street before noon. Mrs. Holt read it 3 times. She told Cecily at luncheon that she had reconsidered, and that of course they would attend the Ashworth ball, and that she was sure Lady Vane had meant only the best, and that Cecily's company at such events was indispensable to her comfort. Cecily said she was glad to hear it. She said it without irony, which cost her something, but which was also true. The Almack's assembly rooms on the last Wednesday of March were as they always were, brilliant and crowded, hot despite the season, the candles doing their extravagant work against the dark. The patronesses were at their table. The orchestra was in its corner. The floor had filled with couples, and the polished machinery of the evening was turning over in its usual way. Cecily arrived with Mrs. Holt at 9:30 and helped Mrs. Holt to her usual chair and made the usual circuit of deliveries and greetings that were her function in this room. She had put on the muslin gown, the retrimmed muslin, the faded hem, the plain cream ribbon, and the repaired glove seam, because there was no other gown, and because she was done pretending she was someone who might possess one. Lady Vane was near the card tables, in the sapphire silk and the jet necklace and the ivory and black fan. Miss Belmore was at her elbow, in the white silk trimmed with gold, pearl drops at her ears. They were deep in conversation, and neither of them looked at Cecily as she moved through the room, and this was, Cecily understood, a deliberate choice on Lady Vane's part. Cecily was not to be acknowledged, because acknowledgement would imply her presence was worth noting. She was standing near the north wall, waiting for Mrs. Holt to finish speaking with Lady Fenwick, when she became aware of a stillness in the room. Not all at once, in parts. The music did not stop, but something in the movement of the crowd shifted. A subtle reorientation of bodies, the small, unconscious choreography of a room that has become aware of something worth watching. She followed the attention as a ship follows a current, and found its source. Julian Ashworth, Duke of Alverston, crossing the room. He was crossing it directly. Not toward the card tables, not toward the patroness's corner, not toward his aunt, who was stationed near the fireplace. He was crossing the room with the particular deliberateness of a man who has made up his mind about something and is now simply executing the decision. The crowd shifted around him. People moved without quite knowing why. Cecily understood where he was going before he was halfway across the floor. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face. And then, in a single, smooth, unhurried motion, he took one step back, brought his heels together, and bowed. It was a full bow, a formal bow, the kind of bow a duke makes to a princess at court, measured and complete, a physical statement in a language everyone in the room was fluent in. The music continued. The room did not. He straightened. His eyes were on hers. The room was utterly silent. In that silence, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as the card tables and no farther, he said, "Miss Warne is my partner for this set." He offered his hand. She looked at him for a moment. The silence held. At the card tables, Lady Vane had gone still in the particular way of a woman who has understood that the moment has moved entirely beyond her reach. Miss Belmore looked at nothing. At the edge of her vision, Cecily was aware of Lord Fenwick, who was the most senior gentleman in the room, leaning slightly toward Lady Fenwick, and of Lady Fenwick's quiet nod. Cecily took his hand. They moved to the floor. The orchestra, after a beat, began again. Around them, the room resumed itself in a different register. Not the easy hum of a room deciding what it thinks, but the different sound of a room that has been given a verdict and is adjusting to it. They danced. He was a controlled dancer, unhurried, and she was better than he might have expected, because she had been taught by a mother who believed that a woman ought to know the things she was taught. They did not speak for the first 2 passes of the floor. Then he said, his voice low beneath the music, "Are you well?" She said, "I am quite well, Your Grace. Thank you." They turned. The candlelight caught the gold in his watch chain and the pale thread of her repaired glove, and the faces of the crowd at the floor's edges, and she thought that she would remember this room for the rest of her life, and would always see it this way, in the particular quality of the light. He said, "My name is Julian." She looked at him. "I am telling you," he said, "because I intend to ask Mrs. Holt's permission to call after this evening, and it seemed ungenerous not to tell you first." She felt the warmth rise in her face, at her throat, across the back of her hand where his gloved palm rested. "Julian," she said, and said it quietly, as a thing she was learning, and he looked at her as though it was something he had been waiting for across a very long distance, and she thought of her father telling her that a person's worth was not a room's business. He had been right. He had only not been there to see the proof of it. Mrs. Holt called the following morning, from her chair by the drawing-room fire, for Cecily to come down and bring the good scissors, because she had a letter to open, and her hands were not equal to the seal. It was not 1 letter. It was 3. There was one from Lady Ashworth, who said that her nephew had asked for the privilege of paying a morning call at Brook Street on Thursday, and that she hoped Mrs. Holt would receive him. There was one from Lord Fenwick, who said nothing specific but who asked after Mrs. Holt's health and mentioned that the Duke of Alverstone had spoken most highly of her establishment. And there was one from Lady Vane, which was short, and which contained a careful sentence about having perhaps misjudged the situation, and remained hers most sincerely. Mrs. Holt read this last letter twice, and then said, with the serenity of a woman who has decided not to look too closely at the machinery of the miracle, that she had always thought Lady Vane was basically well-meaning at heart. Cecily said that she was sure that was true, and kept her face very still, and cut the remaining seals. He came on Thursday, as his aunt had said. He came alone, which was not strictly required, and he stayed an hour, which was the limit of what propriety permitted, and Mrs. Holt fell asleep in her chair 20 minutes in, which she sometimes did, and which neither of them remarked upon. They talked about Cowper. He had the Cowper poems as a boy, he said, a different edition, and he had memorized long passages of The Task before he understood what they were for, which was to give you something to think about when thinking was the only thing you had left to do. Cecily had taken the book from her reticule when she sat down, because it had been in there since October, and she no longer saw any reason to pretend it was not. It lay on the small table between their chairs, the worn spine and the pressed flower still marking the page. He looked at it once. "Your father's?" he said. She said yes. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I have a miniature of my wife. I carry it in my coat pocket. I have been trying for 2 years to understand what it would mean to stop carrying it, and I have not understood it yet." He looked at the book. Perhaps that is not something that needs to be understood. Perhaps it is only something that changes. She looked at him. The light from the south window came across the room between them, pale and clean, the kind of light that does not ask for anything. "I think that is right," she said. "I think that is exactly right." He asked Mrs. Holt when she woke for permission to call again the following Tuesday. Mrs. Holt, who had perhaps not been entirely asleep, and who was a great deal shrewder than her headaches and her failing sight suggested, said that she would be delighted. Spring came late that year, uncertain and gradual, the way it sometimes does in England, testing the air with a few warm days before retreating back into gray. By April, the window over Mrs. Holt's drawing-room fire was open in the afternoons, and the sounds of Brook Street came in with the light, and Cecily sat in the chair she had been given by unspoken custom, the Cowper poems on the table beside her, and thought about the distance between October and now. There had been, in the space of those months, 2 formal calls, 3 morning rides in the park with the Ashworth carriage sent for her by Lady Ashworth as chaperone, and 1 evening at the theater where Mrs. Holt had fallen asleep before the second act, and Julian had leaned very slightly toward Cecily in the dark to say something about the stage machinery, and their shoulders had been close enough that she had been aware of the warmth of him, and she had not moved away, and neither had he. He had asked her, on the 3rd morning ride, what she would want, if she could want anything without the constraint of what was possible. She had thought about it. She had said she wanted a house with books and a window and a garden with a pear tree, and enough to be useful to someone who needed her. He had looked at the park rolling past outside the carriage window for a long moment. Then he had said, "The house at Alverstone has a pear tree in the kitchen garden. It is rather old. I am told it still bears fruit in good years." She had not said anything to that. There were some things that were too large and too careful to be touched before they were ready. He asked her on a Thursday in the 2nd week of April, in Mrs. Holt's drawing room, with Mrs. Holt fully and pointedly awake in her chair and the spring light at the window. He asked her in plain language, without decoration, with the miniature of Catherine visible for a moment, where he touched his breast pocket, and then his hand fell away, because it was there, and always would be, and the thing between them was not a replacing, but a choosing, and she understood the difference. She said yes. Mrs. Holt made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, and demanded to know why no one had told her sooner. And Julian said, with the closest thing to a smile she had yet seen from him, that he had told no one sooner because he had not known sooner himself, and that he hoped she would forgive him. "There is nothing to forgive," Mrs. Holt said. "There never was." Cecily looked at the book on the table, the worn spine and the pressed flower, and the page it had held since her father pressed it flat with a careful thumb. She would not move the flower. She knew that already. She thought that from now on the book would have more pages marked in it, more places it knew, more reasons to be read aloud in the evening to someone who would listen. Outside the window, the pear tree in the kitchen garden at Alverston was greening toward the season, patient and old, bearing what it had always borne. She did not know that yet, and would not know it until July, when she stood under it for the first time with the late sun on her face and the sound of the house coming from the open windows above. She kept the book. If any part of Cecily's journey has stayed with you, we would be glad to know which moment found you. You are welcome to leave it in the comments, and the story will wait there with you until you are ready to move on. The pear tree was there in July, as promised, and the light through its leaves was the particular green gold of old fruit trees in summer. And when Julian came out of the house to find her standing under it, she was still holding the Cowper poems, her thumb at the task, and he stood beside her without speaking, because some things do not require speech. The season had rendered its verdict. He had given her a different one. She had kept it.